The tray trembled for a second while the glassware sang like a warning. No one moved like she did. The robbers shouted, the chandeliers rattled, plates crashed, and the waitress kept folding her hands around a linen napkin as if she were waiting for a customer, not a verdict. Subscribe for more stories like this before we go deeper. The restaurant smelled like burnt coffee and citrus polish. The leather booths held the damp heat of a late dinner, and light from the street made the marble bar flash cold. Evelyn Park wore a waitress uniform with a stain at the cuff and a name tag that had lost a letter. At 31, she carried a history under her ribs that did not fit the apron. Her laugh at parties had been small and guarded, and the laptop she hid in a locker pulsed with files she had once called her life. When the tallest man pointed a gun and called for phones and wallets, Evelyn did not run. She watched, she listened, she catalogued. If you stay with this story, you will see how a single calm decision in the middle of chaos unravels a lie that cost one woman her career and everything she thought she could never get back. Now we go back to the night, to the clatter, to the exact moment a life that had been taken quietly began to push for justice. The downtown restaurant had a hum the way small cities do, a mix of laughter and metal and the faint grease memory of too many dinners. Evelyn moved through that hum, touching mouth of a glass with the pad of her thumb, tasting a trace of lemon from a cocktail that had been poured too sweet. She knew the floor by the way the tile made a certain echo under heels, and she knew every patron in the late shift by the cut of their jackets. At table 10, a man with a blue tie tapped a message with a thumb that smelled faintly of cologne and nerves. At a corner booth, a woman named Rosa Valdez, who worked in the municipal clerk office, talked to a man who owned a small bookshop about taxes. Evelyn bore all of them in a line of sight, the way a reporter keeps the facts. The robbers burst through in a rush that smelled of wet leather and cheap tobacco. One of them, a younger man with a scar below his eye, moved like someone who had practiced panic as a sport, shouting and sweeping. The guests screamed, cutlery chimed against plates, and children began to cry. But Evelyn folded her napkin with slow, precise motions, and when one robber reached behind a patron's chair and knocked a purse to the floor, she stooped and picked up a small envelope without looking like a rescuer. Her hands smelled of dish soap and lemon oil. Later, someone would say she had been fearless. The truth was simpler and stranger. She had been calculating. It was not a coincidence that Evelyn understood the scrape of panic. Before she wore an apron, she had been a software engineer, a lead developer at a small startup that made predictive maintenance software for manufacturing lines. She had written the core algorithm, mapped edge case failures, and sent code into the repository with the quiet precision of someone who loved logic the way others love music. Her backstory began in a small apartment with a cracked radiator, where Evelyn had learned to type with frozen fingers, where her mother, Sandra Kim, had pressed a bowl of soup into her hands and said that nothing was permanent but work. In college at the State University, she had fallen into late nights with Tom Chen, who would become a reporter, and Lila Owens, who later left for a venture firm. They drank cheap coffee, joked about startups, and pushed each other to design something that mattered. When a founder named David Harlow promised stock options and a title that gleamed, Evelyn believed in the script of merit and reward. The company grew, but so did the pressure. Meetings smelled of stale takeout and expensive coffee, office air conditioning hummed like a cage, and the HR emails tasted of corporate phrases that hid intentions. Then the code she had created disappeared into a push request that had been edited, the commit history altered, and her name removed from key documents. She watched as a patent application, filed under a different team name, became the foundation of a lucrative merger. She was exonerated on paper with a terse email that smelled of bleach, then let go with a severance that felt like a final punctuation. She packed her life into a backpack that smelled of dust and lost promises and left the startup world for a job where tips paid the rent. That loss became a hollow that she carried across shifts behind hot plates.
Her backstory is not an exception. It is a pattern of a system that privileges volume over accuracy, influence over integrity, and blurred records over clear credit. The smell of fryer oil became her lullaby. The feel of a tray steadied her when the world had not. In the middle of the robbery, a man in a gray suit shoved a wallet under his chair and began to breathe loud and sharp. The scarred robber kneeled by a booth and demanded the safe code from the manager. The staff, including a busboy named Carlos Ruiz, froze. A line cook, Naomi Singh, hid in the walk-in and banged on a stack of pans until her hands tingled. Evelyn watched the youngest patron, a child with a butterfly bracelet, reach for a fallen spoon. She stepped closer, not to confront the gun, but to give the child something to hold, a way to keep small hands occupied while danger passed. Her voice was low, with the texture that comes from,
"Look at me," she said. "Breathe with me." She felt the child's hair, fine and warm, between her fingers, tasted the copper of fear in her mouth without panicking. A robber cursed and swung an arm that knocked a platter off a server. A wine glass shattered, and the sound rang high and clean, like a bell calling attention. The robber made a move toward the bar, and Evelyn saw a folded envelope glitter against a napkin. She reached, slipped the envelope into her palm, and in the same motion handed the child a napkin to draw on. Later, the envelope would be the fulcrum of a legal fight, a document that would reveal an altered chain of custody and a history of patently questionable filings. For now, it smelled like the starch of a clean napkin and the citrus of a lemon wedge. After the robbers left, with the clatter of fleeing feet and the taste of adrenaline, the restaurant felt like the center of a storm that had passed but not cleared. Patrons sobbed quietly. The manager, Maya Patel, checked the register with hands that shook, and a few regulars, including Tom Chen, who had once been Evelyn's college friend, sat in stunned silence. Evelyn unfolded the envelope in the supply closet where the smell of paper and ink lived. Inside were printed pages, hard copies of emails, and a small USB stick taped under a header. The documents smelled faintly of printer toner and something older, like money. She read a thread with a name that made her stomach tighten. The commit history had been doctored. There were metadatas that did not match the upload dates. A patent had a filing number that referenced an application she had worked on years before. Someone had altered timestamps and removed authorship. She stood there with the evidence in hand and felt the old hurt sharpen into a purpose that felt like a different muscle. She sent a single message to Tom Chen. Evelyn wrote, "I have something you need to see." He replied almost immediately, "Where are you?" They arranged to meet in a cafe that smelled like burnt beans and cinnamon. The sense of danger that had been a dull ache became an electric thread that connected her to the possibility of undoing what had been done. The cafe was small, with a piano in the corner that someone rarely played, and light pooled like honey across a table scarred with initials. Evelyn placed the USB stick on the napkin between them. Tom lifted his head, his breath warm, and said, "I thought you were done with that world." She answered, "I was living on tips until I decided that quitting was not the same as accepting." Their conversation unfolded like a careful negotiation. Tom asked questions in quick jabs, professional and curious. He said, "Who is on the filings now?" She read names aloud. David Harlow was among them, his signature limp. Tom asked, "Do you have backups?" Evelyn said, "I have a local repository and a memory of what belongs to me." Tom pressed for explanations about metadatas and version control. Evelyn explained, slowly, like someone teaching, that a commit is more than content. It carries a history that is hard to erase without leaving traces in logs and in mirrored backups. In the conversation, they started to map a plan. Tom would run a background check on filings and corporate structure. He named 2 lawyers he trusted, Naomi Singh and Ben Albright, though he warned that litigation was long and costly. Evelyn said, "I know, but I cannot let them own what I wrote." She tasted the bitter of the espresso and felt a steadiness bloom. Their dialogue was long and careful, each exchange a stitch. Evelyn, Tom, Evelyn, Tom, Evelyn, Tom, Evelyn, Tom, Evelyn, Tom, until they had at least 9 tight turns where every response revealed a piece of strategy rather than anger alone. The cafe smelled of steam and paper and the possibility of exposure. Within 48 hours, they had a small team forming like an emergency room crew. Naomi Singh agreed to look at IP filings pro bono in exchange for access to what Evelyn had. Lila Owens pulled a contact at a forensics firm named Carlos Ruiz who could parse metadata and check mirror repositories. Rosa Valdez offered to open doors at a local newspaper through a cousin, and a retired auditor named Sandra Kim, Evelyn's mother, who had worked municipal audits, taught them how to follow trails of altered documents. Marcus Blackwood appeared as a new name in their periphery, a private investor who had read Tom's article about corporate malpractice and wanted to know if there was a case to invest in reform. He offered access to a due diligence team and a lawyer who specialized in patent litigation. Naomi was careful and asked for chain of custody protocols before accepting any physical evidence. The team cataloged every item in a small inventory, numbered photographs of the USB, created hashes, and stored copies in 3 separate cloud repositories. Evelyn sat in a small conference room behind the cafe and watched as evidence became process. The air smelled of paper and disinfectant, keyboard keys clicked like a nervous chorus, and a legal pad crinkled each time someone wrote a new note. At this point, we pause. If you were in Evelyn's shoes, what would you do? Would you keep quiet and try to rebuild slowly? Or would you risk everything to expose a lie? Comment, "I would stay," if you would stand and fight, or comment, "I would run," if you would avoid the conflict and move on. Tell us briefly why you chose that path. Your answers help the community see different strategies for survival and reinvention. People have written to say they chose differently in their own lives, and that those choices helped them later on. Now watch what happened next when the team began to pull threads that a corporate empire had hoped were buried. The discovery process was meticulous and felt like archaeology. Carlos Ruiz ran a forensic check on the USB and found that the metadata embedded in several files had been altered in a way inconsistent with how repositories record pushes. He found backup snapshots on a development server that had been scheduled and that retained the original author tags. A forensic report, written with clean language and deliberate dates, clarified the timeline. This technical explanation made sense in one sentence and deserved more detail. In accessible terms, Carlos explained that file systems write a record called an inode, and that version control keeps logs that are distributed across mirrors. When someone force pushes and rewrites history, they leave a shadow in mirror systems and in backups where timestamps and hashes do not align. That inconsistency is provable. The procedure took 10 business days and required subpoenas for certain mirror archives and signatures for access to corporate servers. The chain of custody required the original USB to be photographed, sealed in an evidence bag, and logged at each transfer. Each of these steps had to be done precisely to survive in court. The team filed for emergency discovery and hired an auditor, Sandra Kim, to track internal emails. Her work found a thread where an assistant had been instructed to normalize names on a filing, language that read like bureaucratic camouflage for theft. The smell of old coffee did not leave the workspace during these days. Instead, it became a marker of long nights and steady typing. The offer came unexpectedly as an invitation to a private meeting. Marcus Blackwood, who had a reputation for making quiet interventions in corporate disputes, arranged to meet Evelyn at an office where the scent of polished wood and citrus cleaner suggested wealth without apology. He wore a navy suit that fit like armor and offered his palm to Evelyn like a truce. Marcus said, "I have been following this for a while." He explained that he had lost money because of sloppy mergers and that integrity and IP made markets function. He proposed funding for legal action and a board-level pressure campaign in exchange for equity in whatever new venture Evelyn might spin out if she regained her patent rights.
Evelyn listened and then asked, "What is your motive?" Marcus answered with a small, tired laugh, "I like to be on the right side occasionally, and I like returns." Over coffee that tasted expensive and slightly bitter, they negotiated terms. Naomi and Ben Albright outlined the litigation route and the risk of countersuits under claims of trade secret theft. Evelyn asked about the paper trail and the ability to restore commit histories. Leela Owens advised caution, naming companies and players who might try to bury the story. The conversation was careful and investigative, with alternating statements and clarifying questions that numbered more than 8 exchanges. They left with an agreement. Marcus would fund an initial motion to compel discovery. Tom would run public angle, and Naomi would file for preliminary injunctions. The offer was the small beginning of an alliance that would need courage and precision to survive. They prepared for court like a surgical team preparing for a delicate operation. The lawyers drafted motions, Naomi mapped patent family trees, and the forensic auditor prepared a public report. Evelyn rehearsed testimony with a coach, practicing breathing and the feel of each question. She also reconstructed her own archives, pulling fragments from old discs, emails, and drafts. In one scene of preparation, she spoke with Naomi in a glass room that smelled of lemon disinfectant. Naomi asked, "How will you answer if they say you are fabricating this evidence?" Evelyn said, "I will show the logs, the mirrors, the backups." Naomi nodded and said, "We also need witnesses who can corroborate access and meetings." They prepared depositions from Leela Owens, from a systems admin named Ben Cooper, and from an old manager, Sandra Kim, who could testify about the original development timeline. Each deposition required transcripts that smelled of stale air and the paper that comes from long legal runs. The team worked through nights, the corridor lights a thin river of white, until the morning of the motion hearing arrived. The courtroom was a room of small echoes and large eyes. David Harlow arrived with a legal team that moved like a single organism, Ben Albright at their lead, precise and cold. The judge, Harrington, wore a robe that rustled like silence. Tom sat with a notebook that rattled slightly when he shifted. Evelyn felt the weight of years in her chest, the past crowding into the present like a literal thing. The first moment of tension came as Ben Albright stood and argued a motion to dismiss on grounds of laches and statute of limitations. His voice had the calm of someone who has delayed consequences through money. The gallery smelled faintly of aftershave and paper. Evelyn looked at Naomi and felt a quiet articulation of trust. The press, including a television crew with a camera that hummed, filled the back of the room. The argument ebbed and flowed with legal technicalities and charged undertones. Ben claimed procedural failures. Naomi responded with a forensic timeline. The judge paused like a hinge, and the courtroom exhaled. That moment of tension, where law and memory collided, lasted long enough to taste metallic fear. The judge denied the motion to dismiss and ordered targeted discovery. The ruling felt like the first unlocked door. After the courtroom, they returned to the press conference with a statement. Tom spoke into a microphone and laid out the facts in a cadence meant to reach readers who believed in fairness. He said, "We found edited commit histories, altered metadatas, and a pattern that suggests deliberate misattribution." In the crowd, journalists asked questions
that cut like lights. A young reporter named Julia Reese asked, "What does this mean for smaller inventors?" Evelyn felt the intimacy of the question and answered, "I hope it means we will stop allowing polished memos to erase people's work." The crowd reacted with a mix of applause and skeptical murmurs. The story gained traction. Social media lit like a string of small fires. Public opinion began to bend. One of the most dramatic scenes followed at a corporate shareholders meeting where Evelyn, with Marcus beside her, confronted David Harlow and a board that had built a reputation on acquisitions. The meeting room smelled of lemon water and expensive cologne. A screen showed thin lines of financial graphs, and the room lights were too bright. Evelyn had prepared for the moment with files projected side by side, the original code snippets she had authored, and the claimed patent text.
Tom stood at the back, camera ready, and listeners held breath. The exchanges that followed were long and fierce. David Harlow stood with arms folded and said, "You are trying to discredit a company that built value." Evelyn answered, "You built value on someone else's back." The CFO, Maya Patel, an ally who had been moved by internal memos, interjected, "We need to investigate these claims internally." Ben Albright tried to shut down the exchange by questioning chain of custody, but Naomi presented the forensic hashes and Carlos walked through the mirrored backups that could not have been altered without leaving traces. Each point and rebuttal flowed like a series of waves, where each wave rose and then broke into a new argument. The boardroom dialogue had at least 10 tight exchanges between Evelyn, David, Ben, Naomi, Marcus, Maya, and Lila. Each revelation peeling another layer from a carefully constructed story. The shareholders watched as projected files enlarged and code references scrolled as evidence was laid bare. The room, once a place of decision behind closed doors, became a stage for exposure. People began to murmur, some standing, some leaving in small clusters. The moment built to a crescendo and then a collapse when the board agreed to an independent audit. That audit had technical descriptions that needed clarity. The forensic audit broke down into key steps. Forensic engineers extracted logs from mirror servers and compared cryptographic hashes across repositories to locate inconsistencies. They ran checksum algorithms that confirmed mismatches in 5 critical files, and they reconstructed commit histories through residual snapshots and backup tapes. The auditors requested production of internal Slack transcripts and emails, and subpoenas compelled server logs from the merger partner. Each step required legal authorization and precise handling to maintain chain of custody. This process took 30 days and included 2 court-approved warrants. The report, once complete, contained a timeline, numbered exhibits, and a map of responsibility that implicated specific directors. That description is technical but answerable. The auditors proved alteration by showing discrepancies in timestamps, author IDs, and hash signatures
that are immutable if properly recorded. The language of the report translated forensic evidence into an accessible narrative that jurors and shareholders could follow. That clarity turned public pressure into formal action. The revelation sparked consequences. News outlets ran stories about manipulation of corporate records. Regulators opened an inquiry. The company's stock dipped in a way that reflected both market skepticism and fear of litigious fallout. There was a moment of public shaming that felt like a collective gasp when the audit reports were posted. David Harlow resigned from the board pending investigation. Ben Albright issued a statement denying wrongdoing and saying the firm would defend itself in court. The company froze an ongoing merger meeting until settlement talks could be arranged. Legal filings ensued, including a civil suit for correction of inventorship and a petition to restore patent rights. The legal descriptions required in court filings had to be precise. The litigation process entailed initial pleadings, discovery, depositions, expert reports, and then either settlement or trial. Each phase had typical timelines and costs, often months to years. The team prepared for the long haul, but found the courts moved with a readiness that surprised them. A preliminary injunction was granted to prevent the company from licensing the disputed patent while the suit proceeded. The relief was narrow but meaningful. It stopped immediate damage and created space for a fuller correction. After the dust, the reconstruction began in earnest. Evelyn, exhausted by truth and vindication, started a new venture with Marcus and a small team, including Leila Owens, who agreed to help with fundraising, and Rosa Valdez, who became the head of community outreach. They formed a startup that honored proper attribution, created transparent commit protocols, and offered a platform where inventors could timestamp their work in a distributed ledger that prevented tampering. Naomi served as in-house counsel, and Carlos continued as the chief technology officer, focused on system integrity. They signed a first round of seed investment with a promise clause that required independent audits annually. Contracts smelled of new paper and ink and tasted like possibility. Early clients included manufacturers who had once used the old proprietary system but sought a reliable partner with clear ownership rules. The new company hired 10 employees in its first quarter and built a culture where transcripts of decisions and commit histories were standard practice. Evelyn, who had once hidden a laptop under a mattress, now had an office with a plant and a window that opened onto a street that smelled of rain and possibility. The backstory that had once been a wound became a lesson in governance and in personal reinvention. There were moments of reflection and tension still. Evelyn met with former colleagues who had once watched her leave and who now returned with tentative apologies. Leela Owens confessed that she had seen the altered commit a year earlier, but had been pressured by investors who wanted speed. Evelyn listened without triumph, choosing to build rather than forgive.
To burn. That choice became a theme in town halls and interviews. She came to understand that reconstruction is often quieter than exposure. It involves hiring, training, and the steady art of trusting again. The public perception slowly shifted as clients signed on and journalists ran follow-ups. Tom wrote a feature profiling Evelyn as a person who had learned to hold both anger and hope. The community around her, including neighbors like Rosa Valdez and public officials who had once dismissed her, began to view her as an example of reinvention. Investors who had watched corporate dishonesty from afar reached out to join her cause. The recovery was neither immediate nor total, but it was practical and growing. One of the mandated moments of tension came when the original company countersued, claiming trade secret misappropriation. The claim was that Evelyn had taken proprietary information. For 3 days in a row, the courtroom felt like a pressure chamber. The defense called witnesses, including a former manager, and argued motive and access. Evelyn faced questions designed to unsettle her, to make small inconsistencies look like a pattern. The exchange turned on questions about temp emails and forgotten backups. Naomi cross-examined with calm and surgical focus. The judge asked about intent, and the jury watched like a crowd at a tense game. The tension felt deep and long, 2 paragraphs at least strong enough to hold breath. The verdict, when it came months later, favored Evelyn on claims of inventorship and restored primary authorship to the patent record. It was not a sweep of all claims, but it was a legal correction that would allow her to license the technology and build value under her name. The epilogue follows through with time and practical results. 1 month later, Evelyn's startup had signed its first licensing agreement with a mid-sized manufacturer that valued transparent attribution. The contract included a clause for independent verification every quarter and the use of the distributed ledger for timestamping contributions. Evelyn spent mornings in a small shared office where the coffee smelled like roasted beans and optimism. She sketched product roadmaps on a whiteboard with markers that squeaked, and she hired her first engineer who had once admired her work from afar. Community response was cautious but supportive. Colleagues who had once whispered now offered endorsements. Financially, the company was stable enough to pay salaries and to fund a community scholarship for women in tech. In 3 months, the regulatory inquiry had produced a formal recommendation for corporate transparency and filings, and a local advocacy group led by Rosa Valdez organized workshops to help small inventors protect their work. The startup's user base grew by 20%, and Evelyn began to speak publicly about integrity and the need for accessible verification tools. Her mother Sandra visited the office and cried at a little plaque that read, "In honor of those who build with truth." 3 months in, the atmosphere had shifted in material ways.
Several former colleagues reached out to collaborate. Leela Owens introduced Evelyn to a potential strategic partner who could scale the technology. The board of the original company saw turnovers in executive ranks as investors reacted to reputational risk. Evelyn's company closed a seed round that included Marcus Blackwood and 2 mission-oriented funds. The terms included an unusual clause that tied executive compensation to audits of attribution. The legal landscape began to shift as the case set precedent for how metadatas and commit histories are treated in inventorship disputes. Public commentary framed Evelyn's victory as emblematic of a cultural moment where transparency began to matter. She hosted a community panel that discussed practical steps for documenting innovation, and the event smelled of bagels and a warm sense of purpose. Evelyn was no longer invisible. She had become a leader who sought to make systems fairer. 6 months after the court ruling, Evelyn's life had a different rhythm. The startup had a dozen employees, a rented office with a sunlit meeting room, and a small lab where engineers tinkered with sensors that smelled faintly of electronics and solder. The company had signed 2 more licensing deals and started pilot programs in 3 factories. Evelyn had taken a seat on a small advisory board focused on corporate governance and often spoke about the moral imperative of clear record-keeping. Tom's follow-up feature ran in a national outlet and highlighted not only the legal victory, but the social impact. Evelyn had a personal life that felt quieter. She dated slowly and trusted conversations with a new person who valued integrity as much as ambition. The community around her celebrated with a small party, where Rosa brought pastries, Sandra made a speech about stubbornness and compassion, and Leela toasted to a future where work was credited properly. The final line in public memory was not just that the waitress did not panic during a robbery, but that the woman who had kept calm in the storm helped to change how storms were recorded. If this story affected you, consider subscribing to follow more investigations into how ordinary people reclaim ownership of their work. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear that recovery is possible and that systems can be nudged toward fairness. The memory of Evelyn's calm in the middle of chaos remains a guiding image. She had not been fearless in the cinematic sense. She had been careful, trained by loss, and remade by steadfastness. In the end, she proved that being visible for the truth is a risk that often pays a different kind of dividend. She learned that to be seen by justice is to be responsible for the next work of repair. If you remember one thing from this story, let it be that a small act of steadiness can topple a mountain of excuses and build something that lasts.